When I bought my dream property in rural Tennessee, I thought the biggest threat would be copperhead snakes. Turns out, it was my HOA president who'd been living rent-free on my land for 3 years, then demanded I tear down my house. Here's what happened. I'm drinking coffee on my deck, smell of honeysuckle thick in the morning air, when I noticed this drone hovering overhead. Thought it was just some kid playing around. Wrong. That $2,000 drone survey revealed my neighbor Delilah Thornberry, HOA president and self-proclaimed neighborhood dictator, had stolen 7,200 square feet of my property. Her pool house, deck, and championship rose garden, all built on land I was paying $847 annually in taxes for. But instead of apologizing for this brazen theft, this woman served me with legal papers demanding I demolish my entire house for property violations. Her personal injury lawyer husband threatened a lawsuit that would bankrupt me within 72 hours. What would you do if your neighbor stole 3 years of your property while demanding you destroy your home? Drop a comment with your location and worst HOA nightmare. Let me back up and tell you how a divorced electrician from Memphis ended up in the fight of his life against a suburban dictator with a law degree. My name's Marcus Holloway, I'm 47, and 6 months ago I was picking up the pieces of a life that had exploded like a faulty circuit breaker. 23 years of marriage, gone. Half my assets, gone. The house I'd rewired twice with my own hands, gone to my ex-wife's lawyer. All I had left was my electrical business, my Army pension, and a VA loan that represented my last shot at the American dream. That's when I found 47 Whispering Creek Lane, 2.3 acres of pure Tennessee heaven in a subdivision called Whispering Oaks Estates. 12 houses on large lots, the kind of place where neighbors wave instead of calling code enforcement. A babbling creek ran through the back corner, and the 1970s ranch house sat 400 feet from the road, giving me the privacy I desperately needed to rebuild my life. The moment I stepped out of my pickup for the walkthrough, the smell of wild honeysuckle hit me like a promise. No traffic noise, no sirens, just birds singing and water flowing over smooth stones. After losing everything in Memphis, this felt like salvation for $127,000. Then I met my neighbor. Delilah Thornberry emerged from the McMansion next door like she'd been waiting for fresh prey. 52 years old, real estate agent, driving a white Escalade with vanity plates that screamed, "Sold for you." Her blonde highlights probably cost more than my monthly truck payment, and she had that predatory smile real estate agents perfect in the mirror. "Welcome to the neighborhood, honey," she purred, already eyeing my work van like it was roadkill. "I'm Delilah, HOA president. We maintain very high standards here." The way she said standards made my skin crawl, but I needed this place. This property was my fresh start, my workshop space, my chance to finally have something that couldn't be taken away in divorce court. Delilah's house looked like a Southern Living magazine cover, white columns, perfectly manicured lawn, and a backyard that seemed to go on forever. Every morning at exactly 5:47 a.m., her sprinkler system would start its mechanical tick-tick-tick, precise as a bomb timer. Her pool parties featured bass-heavy music and the sharp scent of chlorine that drifted over our fence line, mixing unpleasantly with the natural creek smell. For 3 weeks, I minded my own business. Then Delilah showed her true colors. I'm walking to my mailbox, work boots crunching on the gravel driveway I'd just extended for my electrical van, when I find a crisp white envelope under my windshield wiper. Professional letterhead, perfectly typed complaint about my unsightly commercial vehicle, violating neighborhood aesthetics, signed with a flowing script and, I kid you not, a little smiley face dotting the I in Delilah. The complaint cited HOA Covenant 4.2.7 requiring residential parking only. But here's the thing about being an electrician. We read the fine print. Commercial vehicles under 3/4 ton were specifically permitted, and my Ford Transit barely qualified as half-ton. I knocked on her door that evening, covenant copy in hand, thinking rational adults could resolve this misunderstanding. "Oh, sweetie," she said, looking at me like I'd tracked mud on her white marble foyer. "We'll just see about that interpretation." The word "sweetie" dripped with enough venom to kill a cottonmouth. That's when the harassment campaign began in earnest. Monthly violation notices for dandelions, faded mailbox paint, Christmas lights in January, each with $50 fines and professional documentation that would make the FBI jealous. Delilah photographed everything, measured everything, documented everything with the obsessive precision of someone building a case. I paid the first few fines because I couldn't afford another legal battle. My divorce had cleaned me out, and this property represented every dollar I had left in the world. But as I'd soon discover, Delilah Thornberry wasn't interested in $50 fines. She was playing a much bigger game, and I was about to become her biggest victim yet. 3 months into my new life, Delilah decided $50 fines weren't enough. She was ready to play hardball, and I was about to learn just how dirty this game could get. It started with an emergency HOA meeting notice slipped under my door on a Tuesday night. Urgent community standards discussion, scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. in Delilah's living room. The crisp paper reeked of her expensive perfume, that cloying floral scent that reminded me of funeral flowers. Thursday evening, I walked into what I thought would be a civilized discussion. Instead, I entered an ambush. Delilah sat behind her mahogany dining table like a Supreme Court justice, flanked by her 2 cronies, Betty Kowalski, a retired bank manager who treated HOA rules like the Constitution, and Harold Pembroke, whose main talent was nodding enthusiastically at everything Delilah said. 3 people. In a 12-house subdivision, 3 people constituted a community emergency. Marcus, Delilah announced, consulting typed notes like she was reading a death sentence. We need to address your flagrant violations of our aesthetic standards. She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation, complete with before and after photos of my property, red arrows pointing at alleged crimes against suburbia, my unauthorized gravel extension, my non-conforming commercial vehicle, even my failure to maintain regulation lawn edges. Then came the finale, new rules they'd just voted to implement. All landscaping required HOA approval, all vehicles subject to aesthetic review, and the killer, retroactive fines for any improvements made without permission. That'll be $500 for your driveway, sweetie, Delilah smiled, sliding an official-looking invoice across her polished table. Payment due within 30 days, or we'll place a lien on your property. $500 for spreading gravel on my own dirt. That night, lying in bed listening to her sprinkler system's mechanical tick-tick-tick, I realized I had 2 choices: roll over like a beaten dog or fight back with the only weapon I had, knowledge. The next morning, I hit Hamilton County Library's legal section like a man possessed. 4 hours under humming fluorescent lights, learning more about Tennessee property law than any sane person should know. My Army training kicked in. Know your enemy, know the battlefield, find their weakness. That's when I stumbled across something beautiful. Back in '98, when I was rewiring a lawyer's office in Memphis, I'd overheard him complaining about HOA paperwork requirements, something about corporate filings and renewal deadlines. I'd filed that conversation away, never thinking it would matter. Now it mattered like oxygen. Tennessee requires all HOAs to renew their articles of incorporation every 3 years with the Secretary of State. Miss that deadline by even 1 day, and your corporate status evaporates. No corporate protection means no legal authority to enforce anything. My hands trembled as I accessed the state database. Whispering Oaks Estates, HOA. Last filing, March 15, 2019. Current date, October 2022. They'd missed renewal by 18 months. The HOA had been legally dead longer than some marriages last. Every fine, every rule, every threat Delilah had made was worth exactly nothing. Less than nothing. It was fraud. The following Thursday, I strolled into Delilah's dining room carrying my own stack of papers. Harold and Betty exchanged nervous glances as I spread state documents across their sacred mahogany table. Fascinating meeting last week, I said, voice steady as bedrock. But I've discovered a small problem with those fines. Delilah's perfectly sculpted eyebrows twitched. Oh? Your HOA dissolved in March 2021 due to administrative neglect. I slid the Secretary of State printouts toward her manicured fingers. You've had 0 legal authority for 18 months. Every fine you've collected was obtained under false pretenses. The color drained from Delilah's face like someone had opened a valve. Betty started shuffling papers like they were on fire. Harold's mouth opened and closed silently. Then the dining room door exploded open. Garrett Thornberry filled the doorframe, 6'3" of personal injury lawyer wrapped in a suit that cost more than my truck. His cologne preceded him like a toxic cloud, expensive but nauseating enough to gag a buzzard. "Evening, everyone," he said, loosening his silk tie with predatory casualness. Delilah mentioned some Technical difficulties with our community standards discussion. He settled into a chair like he owned the building, the block, and possibly the county. Mr. Holloway, Garrett continued, his smile revealing teeth too white to be natural, I think you'll discover that minor filing oversights don't invalidate established property covenants. These homes were purchased with full disclosure of HOA restrictions. He leaned forward and I caught a whiff of bourbon on his breath despite the expensive cologne. Furthermore, your public accusations regarding my wife's character could constitute actionable defamation. We wouldn't want this neighborly disagreement to escalate into something genuinely expensive for you. The threat hung in the air like smoke from burning wire. But I'd been threatened by Taliban fighters and divorce attorneys. Some small-town lawyer didn't even register on my fear meter. The real war was just beginning. Garrett's legal threat should have scared me. Instead, it pissed me off. You don't intimidate a man who's lost everything once. We've got nothing left to lose and everything to prove. 2 weeks later, Delilah launched her next attack with the precision of a military operation. I'm drinking morning coffee on my deck, watching mist rise off the creek, when I spot surveyors tramping through my backyard. Not my surveyors, hers. "Morning, Marcus," Delilah called from her pool deck, voice dripping with fake sweetness. She was wearing a hot pink tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly groceries, sipping what looked like a mimosa at 8 a.m. "Just getting some professional measurements done. Hope you don't mind." I minded plenty, but Tennessee law allows adjacent property owners to survey up to the boundary line. What I didn't expect was the certified letter that arrived 3 days later, demanding I move my entire fence and pay $20,800 for her surveyor's services. According to Delilah's expert, my fence was 18 inches over on her side, a violation that somehow required demolishing my workshop foundation and relocating my electrical panel. The surveyor's report read like a legal document designed to bankrupt me with compliance costs. But here's the thing about being an electrician. You learn to double-check everything before trusting someone else's work, especially when that someone wants $2,800 of your hard-earned dollars. I called Precision Land Surveys in Nashville, run by a guy named Frank Morrison, who'd been mapping Tennessee dirt since before GPS existed. Frank was old school, the kind of surveyor who still used transit equipment and actually read the original plat maps instead of relying on computer guesswork. "Bring me the original deed and any historical documents you've got," Frank said over the phone, his voice gravelly from 40 years of cigarettes and honest work. "If someone's trying to steal your land, we'll find out real quick." The smell of diesel exhaust and freshly turned earth filled my nostrils as Frank's crew arrived the following Monday. Watching them work was like observing master craftsmen, measuring twice, cutting once, referencing documents older than I was. What they discovered made my blood boil and my heart sing simultaneously. Frank knocked on my door that evening, holding survey results that would change everything. His weathered hands unfolded a comparison chart showing 3 different boundary measurements: the original 1960s plat, Delilah's recent survey, and his professional assessment. "Son," Frank said, adjusting his reading glasses, "that lady's surveyor couldn't find his ass with both hands and a GPS unit. Your fence isn't over her line, it's 3 feet inside your own property." But Frank wasn't finished. His crew had discovered something that made Delilah's fence dispute look like small potatoes. "See this area here?" Frank pointed to an aerial photograph marked with bright yellow highlighter. "That's her pool house, deck, and about half her garden. Every bit of it sits on your land. Has been for at least 3 years, judging by the satellite imagery." I stared at the evidence, struggling to process what I was seeing. Delilah hadn't just made a mistake. She'd been systematically stealing my property while simultaneously accusing me of encroaching on hers. "How much land are we talking about?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "0.3 acres, about 13,000 square feet. Frank's expression was grim. "And here's the kicker. County records show she's been claiming and paying property taxes on that acreage, been getting tax breaks for land she doesn't own." Back during my divorce, my attorney had explained adverse possession laws, how someone could potentially claim land they'd occupied openly for a certain period. In Tennessee, that magic number was 7 years of continuous hostile occupation. Delilah had been squatting on my property for 3 years, 2 months. She was exactly halfway to legally stealing 13,000 square feet of my land. The next morning, I composed the most satisfying letter of my life. Certified mail, return receipt requested, demanding Delilah remove all structures from my property within 30 days as required by Tennessee law. I attached Frank's survey, aerial photographs, and property tax records showing her fraudulent claims. Delilah's response arrived faster than a lightning strike. Instead of apologizing or negotiating, she doubled down with the desperation of someone whose bluff had been called. Her new surveyor, a different company this time, produced yet another report claiming Frank had made obvious computational errors. She organized her HOA cronies to sign a petition declaring my survey harassment of a respected community member. But the most telling reaction came at the subdivision mailboxes 3 days later. Delilah cornered me near my truck, her usual composed mask slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "You think you're so smart," she hissed, jabbing a manicured finger toward my chest. "But you have no idea who you're messing with. My husband deals with people like you for breakfast." The threat was clear, but so was her desperation. Delilah Thornberry was running scared, and scared people make dangerous mistakes. I was about to discover just how dangerous she could be. What Delilah did next crossed every line between neighborly dispute and outright warfare. If I thought her fence games were dirty, I was about to learn she'd been holding back her nuclear option. It started with a knock on my door at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Not Delilah this time, a Hamilton County building inspector named Jerry Hutchins, clipboard in hand, looking about as thrilled to be there as a man heading to his own execution. "Mr. Holloway, I've got a complaint filed against your property regarding potential code violations and illegal construction. Mind if I take a look around?" The complaint, filed anonymously but obviously from Delilah, claimed my 1970s ranch house violated current setback requirements and that I'd made substantial additions without proper permits. The paperwork was 3 pages of legal terminology that boiled down to one devastating demand: prove your house is legal or face demolition orders. Jerry walked my property for 2 hours, measuring distances from every conceivable angle. The crunch of frost-dead grass under our feet sounded like bones breaking as we traced the foundation perimeter. He seemed genuinely confused by the complaint. "Sir, I'm not seeing any obvious violations here," Jerry said, scratching his head under his county-issued cap. "This house has been standing since '73 and nothing looks recently modified. You got your original building permits?" That's when the real genius of Delilah's attack became clear. Original building permits from 1973 weren't exactly stored in digital databases. Finding them meant diving into courthouse archives that had survived floods, fires, and 50 years of bureaucratic incompetence. But I had a bigger problem brewing. 3 days after Jerry's visit, I received an official county notice that made my divorce papers look friendly. According to Delilah's surveyor, her third different company, my house allegedly encroached 6 feet onto her property line, violating setback requirements that would have applied when it was built. The county was giving me 60 days to provide definitive proof of compliance or face a demolition order. Demolition of my entire house, the last thing I owned in this world. Delilah's endgame was now crystal clear. She couldn't steal my land through adverse possession if my house was sitting on it, so she'd use county authority to force me to tear it down myself. Then she'd graciously offer to buy my vacant lot for pennies on the dollar. My workshop smelled like sawdust and desperation as I spent sleepless nights researching building codes from the Nixon administration. The fluorescent light above my workbench flickered like a dying heartbeat while I studied setback requirements that had changed 3 times since my house was built. That's when I remembered something from my electrical contractor training back in the 90s. Our instructor, an old-timer named Pete Kowalski, no relation to Delilah's crony Betty, had drilled into us the importance of grandfathering laws. "Boys," he'd said, tapping his coffee-stained manual, "if a structure was legal when built, it stays legal even if codes change. That's called grandfather protection, and it'll save your ass someday." Someday had arrived. I drove to Hamilton County Archives, a basement dungeon that smelled like mildew and broken dreams. After 6 hours of digging through boxes labeled Building Permits 1970-1975, I found gold, my original construction documents, complete with county approval stamps and setback measurements. My house had been built perfectly legally according to 1973 codes, with proper setbacks and full compliance. When zoning changed in 1985, existing structures were specifically grandfathered under state law. Delilah's surveyor had deliberately used current setback requirements instead of the standards that applied when my house was constructed. But as I studied the historical documents, I discovered something that changed the entire game. The original 1962 subdivision plat showed Willow Creek, my property's natural boundary, running 15 feet east of where it flows today. 50 years of Tennessee weather had gradually shifted the creek bed, and with it, the actual property lines that everyone had been measuring from. If the original creek boundary was still legally valid, then Delilah's entire swimming pool wasn't just built on my land. It was constructed in what used to be the creek bed itself, a federally protected wetland area. My hands shook as I photographed the historical plat maps. Environmental violations carried penalties that made property disputes look like parking tickets. Daily fines of $10,000, mandatory restoration costs, potential criminal charges for damaging protected waterways. Delilah thought she was destroying me with building code technicalities. Instead, she'd been committing federal environmental crimes for 3 years while paying property taxes on a floodplain she didn't legally own. The next morning, I received another certified letter from Garrett's law firm. Not a legal threat this time, an offer to settle our property dispute out of court. They'd graciously allow me to deed the disputed acreage to Delilah for $1, and in exchange they'd withdraw the building code complaint. $1 for 13,000 square feet of my land. The audacity was breathtaking, but so was their desperation. Delilah knew I'd found something big, and she was trying to end this before her world collapsed completely. Too late for that, sweetheart. Way too late. What I discovered next didn't just change the game, it flipped the entire board and set it on fire. I'd hired Frank Morrison's crew to do ground-penetrating radar work, hoping to find those original 1962 survey markers buried somewhere under decades of Tennessee topsoil. What they found instead was evidence of a cover-up that went deeper than Delilah's swimming pool. The radar equipment made an electronic whining sound as it swept across my back property line, like a metal detector searching for buried treasure. Except the treasure we found was concrete survey monuments that had been deliberately buried under 3 feet of imported dirt. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank muttered, studying the radar printouts. "Someone's been real busy back here." We started digging. The smell of rich earth and decaying leaves filled the air as Frank's crew unearthed concrete markers stamped with 1962 Hamilton County Survey. These weren't weathered away or naturally buried. They'd been intentionally covered up, probably when Delilah started her landscaping project 3 years ago. But that wasn't the bombshell. The real discovery came when Frank cross-referenced these original markers with county floodplain maps and environmental protection databases. "Marcus," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years surveying Tennessee property disputes, "you need to sit down for this." The original creek boundary, marked by those buried monuments, put Delilah's entire pool complex squarely inside a federally protected flood easement. Not just her pool house and deck, but her award-winning garden, her outdoor kitchen, even her precious koi pond that she'd bragged about in the subdivision newsletter. Every structure she'd built was sitting in what federal law classified as protected wetlands. "How is that possible?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Frank pulled out a manila folder thick with documents I'd never seen before. Because the original subdivision developer went bankrupt in 1967, before final property transfers were recorded. Your neighbor's been paying taxes on and claiming ownership of land that was never legally conveyed to anyone. The implications hit me like a live electrical wire. Delilah's deed contained a legal description that didn't match physical reality. She'd been paying property taxes to Hamilton County for land she didn't own, in a flood zone where construction was federally prohibited, on property that should have reverted to county control when the original developer defaulted. But here's where it got really interesting. Frank had pulled Delilah's homeowner's insurance records as part of his research, public information once you know where to look. Her policy specifically excluded flood damage, and more importantly, it was void for any structures built in federally designated flood zones. "She's been paying premiums for 3 years on insurance that won't cover a damn thing," Frank explained. "Soon as the insurance company discovers her pool's in a protected wetland, they'll drop her policy and potentially sue for fraud." The numbers were staggering. Environmental restoration costs for wetland damage typically ran $50,000 to $70,000 per acre. Daily fines for ongoing violations could reach $25,000 once federal authorities got involved. And if the EPA determined the violations were intentional, which burying survey markers certainly suggested, criminal charges were possible. My mind was racing as Frank laid out the timeline. For 3 years, Delilah had been committing multiple federal violations while simultaneously harassing me about property boundaries. She'd buried evidence, filed fraudulent tax claims, maintained illegal structures, and contaminated protected waterways with pool chemicals. all while threatening to have my legally built house demolished for imaginary code violations. "Frank," I said, studying the survey data spread across my kitchen table, "what would happen if I reported this to the county environmental office?" His weathered face broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Son, this would trigger the biggest environmental enforcement action Hamilton County's seen in 20 years, and your neighbor would be looking at fines that make her property taxes seem like pocket change." Delilah thought she'd been playing chess while I was playing checkers. Turns out we'd both been playing the wrong game entirely. This was about to become a federal case. The moment I understood the scope of Delilah's violations, I knew this fight required more firepower than one angry electrician with a grudge. Time to assemble a team that could take down a federal environmental criminal. My first call went to Sarah Chen, an environmental lawyer in Nashville, who specialized in wetlands protection cases. Sarah had earned her reputation dismantling corporate polluters, and her office walls were covered with newspaper clippings of million-dollar settlements against companies that thought they could outsmart environmental law. "Mr. Holloway," Sarah said during our first meeting, studying Frank's survey data with the intensity of a hawk examining prey, "this isn't just property encroachment. Your neighbor has committed multiple federal crimes while using county authorities to harass you into submission." Her fingers traced the buried survey markers on Frank's maps. Intentionally concealing federal boundary markers is a felony. Constructing permanent structures in protected wetlands carries daily fines up to $25,000. And filing fraudulent property tax claims? That's mail fraud if she used postal services. Sarah's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting Delilah's building code complaints defensively, we'd go nuclear with federal environmental violations that would make county disputes irrelevant. Next, I reached out to Tom Bradley, Hamilton County's environmental compliance officer. Tom had been fighting illegal development for 15 years, and he'd watched too many protected waterways get destroyed by wealthy homeowners who thought rules didn't apply to them. "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to report this," Tom admitted when I showed him the evidence. "We'd received anonymous complaints about pool chemicals in the creek, but every time we tried to investigate, someone would make phone calls to county commissioners. Suddenly, our access would get restricted." Tom's revelation explained Delilah's confidence. She'd been using Garrett's political connections to suppress environmental investigations while systematically violating federal law. But Tom had been building his own case. "I've got water quality reports showing chemical contamination downstream from her property. Chlorine levels that would kill fish populations if this continues much longer." The environmental angle was devastating, but I needed allies closer to home. That's where Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth became my secret weapon. Eleanor was 84 years old, had lived in Whispering Oaks since the original subdivision was built, and possessed a memory sharper than most people's smartphones. More importantly, she'd been quietly documenting Delilah's harassment campaigns against other neighbors for years. "That woman drove the Hendersons out in 2019, Eleanor told me over coffee that tasted strong enough to strip paint. "Property line dispute just like yours. They were young, couldn't afford lawyers, sold their house for $20,000 under market value just to escape her." Eleanor had photographs, letters, even recordings of HOA meetings where Delilah had systematically targeted anyone who challenged her authority. The Riverside family left in 2020 after she claimed their fence violated some made-up setback rule. Pattern's always the same: survey disputes, building code complaints, legal threats until people give up. But Eleanor's most valuable contribution was her relationship with local media. Her nephew worked at Channel 4 News in Nashville, and environmental stories about wealthy lawbreakers always generated viewer outrage. My technical preparation was equally methodical. I installed security cameras covering every inch of disputed property, documenting any attempts to interfere with evidence. The high-definition footage would show exactly where Delilah's structures sat in relation to original property markers. I also hired a drone operator to create aerial documentation showing the full scope of environmental damage. From above, the contrast was stark. Natural creek habitat suddenly interrupted by concrete, chlorinated water, and manicured landscaping that had no business existing in a protected wetland. The financial warfare component was particularly satisfying. I calculated fair market rent for the 13,000 square feet Delilah had occupied for 3 years, approximately $22,000 based on comparable acreage values. Add property tax refunds she'd illegally claimed, and she owed me over $27,000 before considering federal penalties. Sarah helped me prepare lien documents that would freeze Delilah's assets once filed. The moment federal charges are announced, her property becomes evidence, Sarah explained. She won't be able to sell, refinance, or transfer ownership until environmental restoration is complete. My emotional preparation was just as important as the legal strategy. Eleanor introduced me to a property owners' rights group that met monthly at the VFW hall. Listening to other people's stories about HOA abuse and boundary disputes reminded me this fight was bigger than personal revenge. "You're not just fighting for your property," said Jake Martinez, a retired Marine who'd defeated his own HOA in court. "You're fighting for every property owner who's been bullied by people with more lawyers than sense." The waiting period was the hardest part. Environmental investigations moved slowly, and Delilah was getting increasingly desperate as her options disappeared. But Tom Bradley assured me that federal agencies take wetlands violations seriously, especially when there's evidence of intentional concealment. "EPA doesn't negotiate with environmental criminals," Tom said. "Once this investigation goes federal, your neighbor's going to discover what real legal pressure feels like. Time to let the federal government do what it does best, make environmental criminals pay for their crimes." Delilah's desperation reached new heights when she realized federal authorities were circling like vultures. What she did next proved that cornered predators are the most dangerous kind. It started with Tom Bradley calling me at 6 a.m. on a Thursday, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Marcus, we've got a problem. Someone tried to bribe me last night." The story was almost too brazen to believe. Delilah had cornered Tom at the Kroger parking lot, offering him a consulting fee of $5,000 to delay the environmental assessment. When he refused, she'd sweetened the deal to $10,000, claiming the investigation was unnecessary government overreach that would hurt property values for everyone. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Tom said, the disgust clear in his voice. "Nobody's ever been stupid enough to try bribing a federal compliance officer in a grocery store parking lot." But Delilah wasn't finished. By Friday afternoon, she'd organized something called the Concerned Citizens for Property Rights, a fake grassroots group opposing environmental harassment of law-abiding homeowners. The group's sole mission was pressuring county commissioners to stop the wetlands investigation. The irony was beautiful. A woman who'd spent years harassing neighbors with petty HOA violations was now claiming government harassment over actual federal crimes. Her media campaign was more sophisticated than I'd expected. Local Facebook groups suddenly filled with posts about environmental extremists using bureaucratic technicalities to destroy suburban property values. Anonymous accounts shared stories about federal agents seizing innocent people's homes over minor paperwork violations. The posts were too well written and coordinated to be organic. Garrett's law firm was clearly running a professional disinformation campaign to muddy the waters before criminal charges dropped. But their biggest mistake was targeting me personally. Saturday morning, I discovered my electrical contractor van had been vandalized. "Environmental terrorist" spray-painted across both sides in dripping red letters. The smell of fresh paint hung in the morning air like evidence of their desperation. My security cameras had captured everything. At 3:47 a.m., a figure in dark clothing had approached my van, spent 12 minutes with spray cans, then disappeared toward Delilah's property. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify faces, but those size 9 footprints in my gravel matched the designer sneakers Delilah wore for her morning power walks. When I filed the vandalism report, Sheriff's Deputy Mike Hendricks seemed genuinely sympathetic but claimed insufficient evidence for charges. Apparently, clear video footage of someone destroying my property wasn't enough when the suspect had connections in the county courthouse. "Off the record," Deputy Hendricks said as he handed me the incident report, "you might want to invest in better security. Some folks around here don't appreciate outsiders stirring up trouble." The message was clear. Local law enforcement wasn't interested in protecting me from Delilah's escalating attacks, but Delilah's most vicious assault targeted my livelihood directly. Over the next week, anonymous complaints flooded the state electrical licensing board claiming I'd performed substandard and dangerous work on multiple job sites. Each complaint required formal investigation, potentially suspending my license until resolved. Fake online reviews appeared overnight, destroying my business reputation with detailed lies about electrical fires, code violations, and property damage. Clients started canceling contracts, worried about hiring a contractor under investigation for safety violations. The reviews were too specific to be random trolling. Someone had researched my work history, knew my clients' names, even referenced specific jobs I'd completed months earlier. Only one person had that level of detailed information about my business: Garrett's law firm was systematically destroying my income, while his wife committed federal crimes 50 yards from my back door. Then came the nuclear option. Wednesday afternoon, I received a cease and desist letter claiming my harassment campaign against Delilah constituted gender-based discrimination and emotional distress. The letter threatened a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking damages for systematic persecution of a successful businesswoman. The legal document was 12 pages of expensive nonsense, but the implied threat was real. Defending against federal discrimination charges would cost more than my entire property was worth, even if I eventually won. But Garrett had made one crucial error. The letter referenced specific dates and incidents that proved they'd been monitoring my activities, documenting my movements, even photographing my property from illegal vantage points. In trying to intimidate me, they'd confessed to stalking. Sarah Chen's response was swift and brutal. Within 24 hours, she'd filed a restraining order against both Delilah and Garrett, citing their escalating harassment campaign, attempted bribery of federal officials, and destruction of my property. "They're panicking," Sarah explained during an emergency strategy session. "Environmental criminals always follow the same playbook: deny, delay, discredit, then destroy. We're clearly in the destruction phase." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, but Tom Bradley called Friday evening with news that would make court proceedings irrelevant. "EPA's flying investigators down from Atlanta next week," he said, barely containing his excitement. "This is about to become the biggest environmental enforcement action in Tennessee in 20 years. Delilah thought she was destroying me with legal warfare. Instead, she'd attracted federal attention that would destroy everything she'd built on stolen land. Delilah's final desperate gambit proved that when people with money and connections face federal charges, they'll burn down everything around them to save themselves." It started Monday morning when Tom Bradley called, his voice carrying a mix of rage and disbelief. "Marcus, you're not going to believe this. County Commissioner Reynolds just overrode my environmental assessment." The backstory emerged like a bad political thriller. Garrett's law firm had donated $15,000 to Commissioner Reynolds' re-election campaign 3 days before the EPA investigators arrived. Suddenly, our minor property dispute was being portrayed as government overreach that threatened every homeowner's rights. Reynolds had issued an emergency stay on all environmental enforcement actions, claiming he needed time to review the economic impact on working families. The irony was staggering. A millionaire lawyer's wife was now a working family threatened by environmental protection. But Sarah Chen had been expecting this move. "Environmental law supersedes local politics," she explained, spreading federal statutes across my kitchen table. "County commissioners can't override EPA enforcement any more than they can repeal gravity." Her response was swift and surgical. Within hours, she'd filed public records requests for all communications between Reynolds and Garrett's firm, along with an ethics complaint documenting the obvious corruption. Local newspaper reporters started asking uncomfortable questions about campaign donations and suspicious timing. Meanwhile, Delilah's media manipulation reached new levels of absurdity. She'd convinced Channel 12 News to run a feature story about environmental extremists using obscure regulations to steal innocent homeowners' property. The segment portrayed her as a helpless victim of government persecution, complete with tearful interviews about her family's investment being destroyed by bureaucratic technicalities. What the station didn't mention was Garrett's law firm's substantial advertising budget with their parent company, Money Talks, and Environmental Truth Walks. But their propaganda campaign had an unintended consequence. Eleanor Ashworth's nephew at Channel 4 caught wind of the story and started asking his own questions. Real journalists don't like being scooped by obvious PR campaigns, especially when federal crimes are involved. By Wednesday, the corruption story was spreading beyond local media. A Nashville scene reporter had discovered the pattern of donations preceding favorable county decisions. The Tennessee Environmental Council launched an investigation into political interference with EPA enforcement. Even the FBI's Public Corruption Unit started making phone calls. Delilah's response was pure desperation wrapped in legal threats. Her new strategy involved hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on anyone supporting my case. Tom Bradley received anonymous packages containing photos of his house, his children's school, even his wife's workplace. The message was clear: back off or face consequences. The private investigator also targeted me personally, spreading rumors about my military service record and financial problems. Anonymous tips to my clients claimed I was facing criminal charges for environmental vandalism. The harassment was systematic, professional, and completely illegal, but their biggest mistake was targeting Eleanor Ashworth. Thursday morning, Eleanor found her mailbox destroyed and dead fish scattered across her front lawn, an obvious threat related to environmental activism. The symbolism was crude but effective. This is what happens to people who support environmental protection. Eleanor's response surprised everyone. Instead of backing down, she called every neighbor in the subdivision, organizing the first real community meeting we'd had in years. Turns out many residents were tired of Delilah's reign of terror but had been afraid to speak up individually. Saturday evening, 11 of 12 homeowners gathered in the community center. The smell of folding chairs and stale coffee couldn't mask the tension as neighbors finally started sharing their experiences with Delilah's harassment campaigns. The Hendersons attended via video call from their new home in Georgia, describing the systematic harassment that had driven them away. The Riverside family shared recordings of threatening phone calls they'd received after challenging HOA violations. Even Harold Pembroke, Delilah's former crony, admitted he'd been bullied into supporting her through financial threats. "She's been running this neighborhood like a dictatorship for 8 years, said Patricia Murphy, whose fence dispute had been quietly settled after Garrett threatened her with bankruptcy. "We've all been too scared to fight back because nobody wants to face their lawyers alone." But the evening's most shocking revelation came from Janet Torres, who'd worked in the county tax assessor's office before retiring. "I tried to report the property tax discrepancies 3 years ago," she admitted, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "My supervisor buried the investigation after getting pressure from the county attorney's office. The pattern was clear. Delilah and Garrett had been using political connections and legal intimidation to suppress investigations, silence victims, and maintain their criminal enterprise for years. But their corruption network was finally collapsing. EPA investigators don't care about local politics or campaign donations. Federal environmental crimes carry mandatory penalties that no amount of political influence can override." Monday morning brought news that changed everything. Tom Bradley called with barely contained excitement. EPA's filed federal charges, Delilah's looking at criminal prosecution, civil penalties exceeding $200,000, and mandatory environmental restoration. The federal hammer was finally coming down, and no amount of local corruption could stop it. The Hamilton County Council chambers had never seen anything like it. Standing room only, TV cameras from 3 Nashville stations, and enough tension to power the building's electrical grid for a week. I arrived 30 minutes early wearing my best button-down shirt and carrying a leather portfolio thick with evidence that would end Delilah's reign of terror. The smell of nervous sweat and fresh coffee filled the air as reporters interviewed residents about the environmental crimes scandal that had been dominating local headlines. Sarah Chen sat beside me at the petitioner's table, her laptop loaded with federal documentation that would make tonight's presentation devastating. Tom Bradley occupied the witness section, flanked by 2 EPA investigators whose presence had already sent county commissioners scrambling for cover. Then Delilah made her entrance. She swept through the chamber doors like she was arriving at a charity gala, wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Garrett followed behind, his usual arrogant swagger replaced by the careful movements of a man walking through a legal minefield. But I could see the cracks in their facade. Delilah's perfectly manicured hands trembled slightly as she arranged papers at the respondent's table. Garrett kept glancing at the EPA investigators like they might arrest him before the hearing ended. County Council Chairman Patterson called the session to order, his voice carrying the weight of a man who knew tonight would make or break several political careers. "We're here to address environmental compliance issues regarding property disputes in the Whispering Oaks subdivision." Sarah stood first, her presentation methodical and devastating. Slide by slide, she documented 3 years of federal environmental crimes: structures built in protected wetlands, survey markers buried to conceal evidence, fraudulent property tax filings, and chemical contamination of Willow Creek. The audience gasped audibly when Sarah displayed aerial footage showing the full scope of Delilah's illegal construction. Side-by-side comparisons of 1962 survey maps versus current satellite imagery made the violations undeniable. "The defendant has occupied 13,000 square feet of protected wetlands," Sarah announced, her voice carrying to the back of the packed chamber. "Daily fines have been accumulating at $10,000 per day since EPA notification 3 weeks ago. Current penalties exceed $210,000 and counting." Delilah's composure cracked like ice in a spring thaw. She whispered urgently to Garrett, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. EPA investigator James Morton took the microphone next, his federal credentials lending weight that no local politics could challenge. This represents one of the most egregious cases of intentional wetlands destruction we've documented in Tennessee, he stated, his voice clinical but damning. Evidence indicates deliberate concealment of federal boundary markers, systematic contamination of protected waterways, and fraudulent claims of property ownership spanning multiple years. Criminal referrals have been submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The chamber erupted in murmurs as the criminal implications sank in. Delilah wasn't just facing fines, she was looking at federal prison time. But the knockout punch came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Ashworth approached the public comment microphone, her 84-year-old frame carrying the moral authority of someone who'd watched this community for 6 decades. "I've lived in Whispering Oaks since 1963, Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the camera lights. "I watched Delilah Thornberry systematically drive good families from this neighborhood through harassment, intimidation, and legal abuse." Eleanor's testimony was devastating because it was personal. She named names, cited dates, and described a pattern of behavior that transformed Delilah from environmental criminal into neighborhood predator. The Hendersons, the Riverside family, 3 other couples who sold and moved rather than fight her lawyers. She's been destroying our community for 8 years while committing federal crimes in her backyard. When Eleanor finished, the chamber was silent except for the whir of camera motors capturing every moment. Finally, Delilah rose to respond. Her prepared statement about government overreach and property rights sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. But as federal penalties and criminal charges were discussed, her carefully constructed victim narrative collapsed completely. "This is persecution," she suddenly shouted, jabbing a finger toward the EPA investigators. "You people are destroying successful women who built something beautiful. My garden is an asset to this community." The outburst was political suicide. Television cameras captured every word as Delilah revealed the entitled arrogance that had driven 3 years of criminal behavior. "Your beautiful garden," Sarah replied calmly, "was built on stolen land in violation of federal environmental law. The EPA doesn't recognize aesthetic value as a defense for wetlands destruction." The council's vote was unanimous: immediate enforcement of all federal penalties, mandatory removal of illegal structures within 60 days, and full environmental restoration at Delilah's expense. As the gavel fell, ending Delilah's criminal enterprise, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my divorce was finalized: justice. Deputies served federal court papers as the meeting adjourned. Delilah and Garrett left through a side exit, avoiding the reporters shouting questions about corruption, environmental crimes, and political payoffs. The federal government had finally done what local authorities wouldn't: held wealthy criminals accountable for their actions. 3 months later, I'm sitting on my deck with my morning coffee watching bulldozers dismantle what used to be Delilah's illegal empire. The sound of concrete breaking and machinery grinding fills the air, but it's the sweetest music I've ever heard. Federal justice moves slowly, but when it arrives, it's thorough. Delilah's pool house came down first, followed by her deck, outdoor kitchen, and that prize-winning garden she'd been so proud of. Every structure built on my stolen land was demolished at her expense, restoring 13,000 square feet of protected wetlands to their natural state. The financial devastation was complete. Environmental restoration costs hit $127,000. Federal fines topped $340,000. Legal fees from fighting EPA charges consumed another $180,000. Delilah's homeowner's insurance, voided by environmental violations, covered exactly nothing. Her real estate license was permanently suspended after the state board reviewed evidence of fraudulent property claims. Garrett's law firm faced ethics sanctions that cost them 3 major corporate clients and their reputation in Hamilton County legal circles. Within 6 weeks, the "for sale" sign appeared in their front yard. The McMansion that had symbolized their suburban dominance sold for 30% below market value. Environmental liens and pending federal investigations tend to discourage buyers. The criminal charges were the final nail in their coffin. Delilah pleaded guilty to environmental crimes, mail fraud, and evidence tampering, receiving 18 months federal probation and community service restoring damaged wetlands across Tennessee. Garrett avoided prosecution by cooperating fully and paying additional restitution for his role in the cover-up. But the real victory was what happened to our community. With Delilah's reign of terror ended, neighbors started talking to each other again. Property disputes were resolved through conversation instead of lawsuits. The HOA was properly refiled and restructured with term limits, transparent finances, and actual representation from all 12 homes. Eleanor Ashworth, bless her heart, nominated me for HOA president at our first legitimate election in 8 years. I won unanimously, though I suspect my main qualification was being the guy who'd taken down the previous dictator. My electrical business rebounded stronger than ever. Turns out, being the man who defeated environmental criminals and corrupt HOA boards makes for excellent word-of-mouth advertising. Clients started specifically requesting the electrician who fought federal charges and won. The settlement money from Delilah, $47,000 in back rent for my stolen land plus legal fees, allowed me to build the workshop I'd dreamed about since buying this property. The smell of fresh lumber and new electrical panels reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this place originally. 6 months after the EPA investigation concluded, I launched the Marcus Holloway Scholarship for military veterans pursuing trade certifications. $2,000 annually for any former service member learning electrical work, plumbing, or construction skills. It felt good using Delilah's penalty money to help people build legitimate careers instead of criminal enterprises. The environmental restoration project became something special. What started as federal mandate evolved into community pride. Local schools bring classes to study restored wetlands habitat. Tennessee Environmental Council uses our creek as an example of successful restoration. Even the EPA investigators return periodically to document fish populations recovering in waters that run clear for the first time in years. Last month, we held the first annual Whispering Oaks Creek Festival on the acreage Delilah used to occupy illegally. Local bluegrass bands, environmental education booths, and barbecue that drew families from 3 counties. Children played in areas where Delilah's pool house once violated federal law. The festival raised $8,000 for creek conservation and community scholarships. Turns out, protecting the environment is more popular than destroying it for personal gain. Eleanor Ashworth, now 85 and still sharp as a surveyor's transit, serves as our unofficial neighborhood historian. She's documenting this entire story for the Hamilton County Historical Society, ensuring future residents know how close we came to losing our community to one woman's greed and entitlement. Standing on my deck tonight, watching fireflies dance over restored wetlands while the creek runs clean and natural, I'm reminded why I fought so hard for this place. This isn't just property, it's home. Share your HOA nightmare story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else going through the same battle. And subscribe for next week's story about how a parking dispute led to a $1 million lawsuit that changed municipal law forever. Sometimes standing up to bullies doesn't just save yourself, it saves everyone around you.